You wrote to us very recently about the bounce back loan schemes, Ms Mumby, and James Wilde is just going to pick up some points from that letter. Mr Wilde, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, Ms Mumby, you wrote to us post the hearing where we had quite a lot of discussion about the level of fraud and the recoveries process. You've obviously written to us, but I think it's important we get some of this on the record for people who watched that hearing but may not have read the correspondence. So, first, on the recovery period, you stated to this committee that lenders were expected to pursue recoveries beyond 12 months, but that's not correct, is it?
That's right. So there will be circumstances where they will pursue recoveries beyond 12 months. For example, if they've already begun a repayment plan during the 12-month period. So it is true that there will be some legacy activity beyond the 12 months. But the decision made by ministers at the time of the launch of the scheme was that 12 months was a reasonable cap to put on the time that lenders needed to invest in recoveries, for no reason other than that after that point it's unlikely that significant recoveries would be achieved unless, as I say, the process had been begun before the 12-month period.
And what's the minimum period which banks are required to pursue recoveries for?
There isn't a minimum period per se. If there's evidence in the case of a particular loan that there's no good reason to pursue recoveries, at that point banks can claim on the loan. In most cases we would expect recoveries to have a duration of many months, indeed approaching 12 months, but there isn't a minimum requirement on time.
So would that be, for instance, bankruptcy?
It's a minimum requirement on effort as opposed to time, if you see what I mean. So if there's a company that no longer exists and there's no money to go after, we don't sort of require a process to be carried out for process's sake.
Okay, you also said that lenders had to wait until the 12 months had elapsed to make a claim on the guarantee. Again, that wasn't correct, was it?
That's right. As I just said, they can claim on the guarantee at the point at which they have carried out a sufficient and robust level of recoveries, and that's what the BBB's audit processes will ensure that they're doing.
And obviously some guarantees have already been paid out. What's the shortest period that a lender has claimed the guarantee before?
I don't know that, but I'd be happy to confirm. Absolutely.
On fraud, my reading of the letter is that provided a lender carries out the minimum checks, there's no mechanism for the bank to get that money back if it's subsequently considered to be fraudulent activity. Is that correct?
Providing the bank has carried out their checks at the start when the loan was issued, so there's sort of two cases. The first case is a case where a bank has or hasn't, for example, carried out KYC checks at the point of the loan being issued. If they haven't, then that would be a reason, straightforwardly, why the guarantee would be suspended. Assuming that has been carried out, the question is whether the bank is fulfilling the requirements of the loan agreement in terms of going through their standard recoveries and fraud prevention processes. As long as they're following those processes and are audited to be doing that, there is no way of stopping them claiming on the guarantee. The setup from the very beginning of the scheme was that banks were being asked to put out money in an environment in which we knew there was a risk of fraud, and it was for the public purse to carry that risk, not for the individual banks, unless those banks had failed to comply with those fraud prevention measures at the start of the loan, like KYC.
Okay. Clearly, it's regrettable you made those errors. I mean, why did you, as the accounting officer, misspeak on various points about the recoveries process to the committee? I
mean, as you know, I appear in front of this committee very often. I do my very best to be accurate on all points, and I hope I've got a pretty good record. We all occasionally misspeak. And to be fair, the question about the 12 months, I mean, as you can imagine, I've gone back and kind of checked that very carefully with the team to make sure I understood it. I don't think I had appreciated the full detail of the complexities about the circumstances in which activity did take place after the end of 12 months. As I say, some activity does, but I shouldn't have characterised it in the way that I did.
Yes, okay. Well, no, you do appear regularly and give good evidence. So, a couple of weeks after your evidence, Lord Agnew obviously resigned and made a number of points about the fraud process. One I just want to ask about, he highlighted the lack of a single dashboard or management information to scrutinise lenders, which was something we touched on. When, as accounting officer, will you have that in place?
We're planning to present it to the Cross-Whitehall Counter-Fraud Board that we will be establishing at a more senior level following Lord Agnew's resignation next month.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And because, as you know, this committee is very concerned about the levels of fraud. One, we want to see lessons learnt from what's happened in the pandemic for any future situations, but we will continue to pursue every department, including yours, which is a part of the theme of today's hearings.
His resignation speech, Lord Agnew said that at the start of the pandemic, your department only had 2 counter-fraud officers. He's described them neither in being experienced in the subject. He's also said that the counter-fraud officers that you had didn't engage constructively with counterparts in the Cabinet Office. Is that correct? And
so it's absolutely correct that we only had 2 counter-fraud people in our counter-fraud team at the start of the pandemic. By the way, I don't think that was the wrong number. It's important to say that the historic rates of fraud across the department have been really, really low. This is a 1,000-fold increase in the level of fraud that we're managing as a department coming out through these schemes. So, but it's absolutely factual to say that we had a very small team at that time. Of course, it's significantly expanded now. I think it's fair to say we wouldn't fully recognise the claim that we did not engage with the Cabinet Office counter-fraud function. And indeed, I take the opportunity to say thank you to the Cabinet Office counter-fraud function, who've been a big supportment to the department, including really quite quickly supporting us with adding a deputy director for counter-fraud into the department, borrowed from elsewhere in government, so that we could quickly scale up that team with the right kind of expert resources. And it's fair to say, I mean, you can imagine when I saw that, I went back and asked the relevant teams sort of many detailed questions like, how often have you met with the Cabinet Office counter-fraud function? And it's fair to say that the numbers are, we're meeting with these, with the central teams, multiple times a week across the department. So, I haven't heard Lord Agnew's sort of points in detail directly, so I don't know exactly what it is led to him to say that. But from our point of view, we absolutely recognise the point about not having sufficient anti-fraud resources at the beginning of this process because we didn't know what was coming. I wouldn't recognise the point about not having worked closely with the Cabinet Office.
thank you. Something else that Lord Agnew said, he described it as schoolboy errors. For example, allowing more than 1,000 companies to receive bounce-back loans which were not even trading when COVID struck. Is that figure something that you recognise, something you're aware of?
Yes, I mean, this goes to the point about what sort of checks were required at the beginning of the process. It was a really difficult balance. How much checks do you ask people to go through at the cost of meaning that loans will be put out much more slowly? I mean, we've sort of litigated the point quite a lot in front of this committee, and I mean, yes, that's right. I mean, I'm not sure it's right to describe it as an error, but it is true.
At what point did you become aware that, as well as being a potential risk, it was turning into a real risk? At what point did you become aware that companies were being set up for what appeared to be primarily the purpose of defrauding you? The reason I'm hesitating is that I wasn't in the seat at that point. So the question you're really asking me is, at what point did my predecessor come aware? And I feel a little bit uncomfortable answering that question. But what I will say is, we knew from the very beginning that those risks were there. We had a really quite comprehensive, done with external support, fraud risk assessment done before the launch of the scheme. So there was no moment of realisation. It was much more of a question of, okay, these risks are now are coming to light much in the way that we expected. I would say in the case of bounce-back loans in particular, I think our upfront assessment of what would happen proved to be pretty accurate. I don't think there was a prediction problem, if that makes sense. I would slightly draw a contrast. I think it's fair to say that depending on how the numbers emerge, I think we have been more surprised by the level of potential error in the grant schemes. We knew there would be challenges, but the extent to which that looks like it may have been the case has been a bit more surprising. So I'd draw that contrast. During the year that we're looking at, 2020 to 21,
Did you get any alerts from Companies House that they'd picked up anything unusual in either new company registrations or company dissolutions?
Well, we very quickly had in place various data sharing agreements between the BBB and Companies House, also working with indeed this is another place where the Cabinet Office Counter-Fraud team were involved, to make sure that we were doing data sharing. So that was about being able to put a date check, exactly to your point about companies who didn't exist at the right moment. Companies House data allowed us to stop that happening. I don't know, that's not quite your question. So Companies House definitely involved. Your question was specifically around whether we saw any unusual patterns. I'd have to go back and check the records on that specific question.
According to the Companies House annual report, between 2015-16 and 2019-20, they averaged about 640,000 new company registrations a year. It never varied more than about down to 610,000 up to 670,000. In 2020 to 21, there was more than 810,000 new company registrations. That's more than 20% higher than any of the previous 5 years. Does it strike you as surprising that should happen during a year when for about half of the year the economy was in lockdown and companies weren't able to trade?
Well, I think I'd be keen to get Companies House's opinion on that specific question before I answered in full. But it is fair to say that disruption, while it's very difficult, also creates economic opportunity. And there are all sorts of new, companies that set up, for example, to make masks. Just to give an obvious example, it's not inconceivable that you might have seen significant increases in
70,000 new companies to make PPE. Honestly, does that sound credible?
No, I'm not suggesting, of course, that all of those would have been doing PPE, but there's all sorts of, for example, if your company that you currently had was having a difficult time, that might be a reason to set up a new company doing something different. Equally, if you were a self-employed trader and you wanted to be incorporated so that you could access some of the government schemes more straightforwardly, that would be another reason to start up a company. So, I'd very happily ask Companies House for some analysis of kind of what they think makes that up. I'm just saying I don't think we can jump smoothly to the conclusion that that is necessarily an indicator of anything adverse.
It would certainly appear to have been a warning sign that needed to be more closely investigated. Were you aware there had been a big increase in company registrations? Did you become aware of it through other means? Did Companies House alert you to the fact that there might be something happening that wasn't correct?
As I say, I wasn't in the seat at the time, so I'm afraid I'd need to check the record about what correspondence was received or what conversations were had.